Imagine being 5 years old and never having owned a toy, never celebrating a birthday, never learning to read or write, never being able to call your own mother mama in front of white people. Now imagine that this wasn't a punishment. This was simply life. Your entire existence mapped out before you even took your first breath. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of black children growing up on southern plantations in 1850. And today, we're going to walk through a day, a year, and ultimately a lifetime in their shoes. What you're about to hear isn't easy. But it's important, because these were real children, with real dreams, real fears, and real stories that deserve to be told. This is what life was like for a black child growing up on a plantation in 1850. Let's start at the very beginning. Birth on a plantation. When a black child was born into slavery in 1850, there was no birth certificate, no official record in most cases. The only documentation might be a single line in the plantation owner's ledger book, listing the baby as property, right alongside livestock and equipment. A typical entry might read, Negro girl born to Betsy Field Hand, January 1850, valued at $50. $50. That's what a human infant's life was worth in the accounting books. For the first few years, these children stayed close to their mothers. Not out of kindness from the enslavers, but out of necessity. Infants needed to nurse, and mothers needed to work. So plantation owners created what they called nurseries, though that word suggests far more care than actually existed. These nurseries were often just wooden shacks at the edge of the fields. One elderly enslaved woman, too old for hard labor, would watch over a dozen or more babies and toddlers while their mothers worked from sunrise to sunset. The children would lie on the dirt floor, on scraps of cloth if they were lucky. In summer, the heat was suffocating. In winter, the cold seeped through every crack in the walls. Mothers would run back during brief breaks to nurse their babies. They had maybe 15 minutes, twice a day. Some women had to run half a mile or more just to reach their children. If they took too long, they'd face the whip. One formerly enslaved woman, Harriet Jacobs, later wrote about watching mothers run to their babies with their clothes still soaked with sweat from the fields, their hands bleeding, their bodies exhausted. They would hold their infants for just a few precious minutes, trying to pour a lifetime of love into those stolen moments. The infant mortality rate for enslaved children was staggering. Nearly half of all black children born into slavery didn't live to see their first birthday. Disease, malnutrition, accidents in those overcrowded nurseries. There was no doctor for enslaved children. If a child got sick, they either recovered on their own or they didn't. And when a child died, their mother might not even be allowed to stop working for the funeral. She'd have to bury her baby before dawn or after sunset on her own time. But let's follow the children who survived, because their story is just beginning. Around age 5 or 6, something changed. This was when enslaved children began to understand what they were, what their life would be. Up until this point, black and white children on plantations sometimes played together. The planters' children might run around the yard with the enslaved children. They were all just kids, at least in their own minds. But then came the moment of realization. Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in Maryland, wrote about this awakening. He described playing with his master's son, sharing games and laughter. Then one day, the white child casually mentioned that when he grew up, he would own Frederick. That Frederick would work for him, just like Frederick's parents worked for his parents. Douglass wrote that it felt like a curtain being pulled back, revealing a terrible truth he'd somehow not fully seen before. This was also the age when enslaved children received their first real job assignments. Up until now, they might have done small tasks, gathering eggs, fetching water, simple things. But around age 6, they entered the labor force officially. For most children, this meant becoming what plantation owners called quarter hands or trash gangs, groups of children, usually supervised by an older enslaved person, would be sent to do lighter field work, pulling weeds, picking worms off tobacco plants, gathering loose cotton after the adult harvest, carrying water to field workers in the blazing heat. The work lasted from dawn until dusk. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours during harvest season. There were no child labor laws, no mandatory schooling, no protection whatsoever. And this is when the violence truly began. Plantation overseers, the men hired to manage the enslaved workforce, carried whips. And they used them on everyone, including children. If a child worked too slowly, the whip. If a child talked back, the whip. If a child was caught playing when they should have been working, the whip. Sometimes the punishment was being locked in a small shed for hours in the heat. Sometimes it was being denied food for a day. One formerly enslaved man, James Curry, recalled being whipped at age 10 for accidentally breaking a dish. Another, Henry Bibb, remembered watching his younger sister being beaten for crying when she was separated from her mother. The psychological impact of this violence was profound. These children learned to suppress their emotions, to never show pain, to never complain. They learned to become invisible, to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. But here's what's important to understand. Even in the midst of this brutality, these children found ways to be children. They created games from scraps, they told stories. They sang songs when they thought no one was listening. They formed deep bonds with each other, creating a community of resilience that would sustain them through unimaginable hardship. Their humanity persisted, even when the system tried to crush it. Let's walk through a typical day for a 10-year-old enslaved child on a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1850. The day began before sunrise. A horn or bell would sound around 4:30 or 5 a.m. Everyone, including children, had to be up immediately. There was no snooze button, no gradual waking. You got up or you faced punishment. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was usually cornmeal mush. Sometimes there might be a piece of salt pork, but that was rare for children. The meal was eaten quickly, often while standing, directly from a shared pot. No plates, no utensils for the children. You ate with your hands. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, everyone was in the fields. For cotton plantations, which dominated the Deep South, the work varied by season. In spring, children helped prepare the soil and plant seeds. They'd walk behind adults, dropping seeds into furrows in the earth. The work required bending over constantly. Imagine doing that for 10 hours straight. Your back screaming, your hands blistered. You're 10 years old. In summer, it was chopping time. This meant using hoes to remove weeds from around the growing cotton plants. The sun was merciless. Temperatures regularly exceeded 95, even 100 degrees. The humidity made it feel like you were breathing underwater. There was no shade, no sunscreen. No water breaks unless the overseer permitted it. Children as young as 8 or 9 were expected to chop a quarter acre per day. If they didn't meet their quota, punishment followed. Then came harvest season, late summer into fall. This was the most intense period. Cotton had to be picked when it was ready, and every hand on the plantation, from age 6 to age 60, was in the fields. Each child was given a cotton sack, rough burlap that rubbed your skin raw where it hung across your shoulder. The goal was to fill it, empty it into a wagon, and fill it again. Over and over, the sharp cotton bolls cut your fingers. By the end of harvest season, every cotton picker's hands were covered in scars. Children were expected to pick anywhere from 40 to 100 pounds per day, depending on their age and size. Adults had quotas of 150 to 200 pounds or more. At the end of each day, the cotton was weighed. If you came up short, you knew what was coming. Around noon, there was a brief break for dinner. The main meal was usually more cornmeal, sometimes mixed with vegetables like collard greens or sweet potatoes. Occasionally, there might be buttermilk. The meal lasted maybe 30 minutes, and then it was back to the fields. Work continued until the light failed, usually around 7 o'clock or 8 p.m., depending on the season. But the day wasn't over. After field work, there were still chores. Children had to gather firewood, feed animals, haul water from the well or creek. Enslaved families had to prepare their own evening meal, usually in a small cabin they shared with multiple other families. These cabins were crude structures. Typically, one room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, housed 6 to 8 people. There were gaps in the walls where wind and rain came through. The floor was dirt. There might be a crude fireplace for heat and cooking, but often the smoke had nowhere to go except through the gaps in the walls. Furniture was almost non-existent. Maybe a rough wooden table. Sleeping pallets on the floor made from corn husks or straw if you were lucky. Most children slept on the bare ground, huddled together for warmth in winter. Supper was usually leftovers from dinner or more cornmeal mush, and then, finally, sleep. But even that was brief, because in just a few hours, the horn would sound again. This was every day. 7 days a week during harvest season. 6 days a week otherwise, with Sunday offering a partial day of rest. There was no school, no playtime, no childhood as we understand it. And yet, in those stolen moments between exhaustion and sleep, enslaved families created pockets of normalcy. Parents told their children stories. They sang spirituals, songs that carried coded messages of hope and sometimes of escape. They passed down oral histories, making sure that children knew who they were, where they came from, even if they'd never be able to go back. These moments were acts of resistance. They were declarations that slavery might control their bodies, but it couldn't completely control their spirits. Here's something that might surprise you. It was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write in most southern states by 1850. That's right, illegal. Laws varied by state, but the general principle was the same everywhere. In South Carolina, the law stated that any person who taught a slave to read or write could be fined $100 and imprisoned for 6 months. In Georgia, the penalty included a fine and whipping. Why? Because plantation owners understood something crucial. Literacy was power. An enslaved person who could read might read about abolition, might read the Bible themselves and question religious justifications for slavery, might forge a travel pass and escape, might write their own story and expose the truth to the world. So education was forbidden, criminalized. But here's what the enslavers didn't count on. The determination of people who understood that knowledge was the pathway to freedom. Enslaved children found ways to learn anyway. Some learned from sympathetic white children who shared their lessons in secret. Frederick Douglass famously learned his letters by challenging white boys to writing contests, tricking them into teaching him while making them think they were showing off. Others learned from free black people who visited plantations, sometimes pretending to be illiterate themselves while secretly teaching at night. Sunday schools, ostensibly for religious instruction, sometimes became covert classrooms. A child might learn to recognize letters by studying Bible verses, even though they were only supposed to listen to them being read aloud. The risks were enormous. If caught, a child could be severely beaten. The person teaching them could be sold away or worse. But still, they tried. One formerly enslaved woman, Susie King Taylor, recalled learning to read at age 7 from a free black woman in Savannah who ran a secret school. The children had to hide their books and slates under their clothes, on the way to and from the lessons. If they were stopped by patrollers, white men who monitored enslaved people's movements, they could claim they were running errands. These children understood, even at young ages, that education was rebellion. Every letter learned was an act of defiance. Every word read was a small victory against a system designed to keep them ignorant. And they paid attention to everything. They memorized overheard conversations between white people. They learned geography by listening to traveling merchants. They calculated math by watching transactions, learning to count even when they pretended not to understand. This hunger for knowledge, this determination to learn despite every obstacle, would later fuel the remarkable literacy rates among formerly enslaved people after the Civil War. Within just a few decades of emancipation, literacy rates among Black Americans soared, a testament to how desperately they had always wanted to learn. But in 1850, for a child on a plantation, that future was unimaginable. All they knew was the present and the constant fear of what tomorrow might bring. There was one fear that haunted every enslaved child every single day, a fear that woke them up at night, a fear that never, ever went away, the fear of being sold. By 1850, the domestic slave trade was booming. The cotton industry in the Deep South was expanding rapidly, and plantation owners needed more workers. Where did they get them? They bought them from the Upper South, from states like Virginia and Maryland, where tobacco farming was declining. Enslaved people were commodities, investments, and like any investment, they could be sold when the owner needed cash or wanted to expand their operation elsewhere. For children, this meant that any day could be the day they were torn from their families forever. Sometimes there was warning. A plantation owner might announce they were selling several people to pay off debts. Families would wait in terror to hear which names were called. But often, there was no warning at all. A child might be working in the fields when a slave trader arrived. The trader would inspect the workers like livestock, checking teeth, examining muscles, looking for signs of health and strength. Then money would change hands, and suddenly that child was being loaded onto a wagon, their mother screaming and trying to run after them, held back by others who knew that resistance would only make things worse. The domestic slave trade separated an estimated 1 million enslaved people from their families between 1790 and 1860. Think about that number, 1 million people. A forced migration driven by profit, destroying families with the stroke of a pen. Children as young as 8 or 9 could be sold away from their parents. Sometimes siblings were separated, sold to different buyers. Sometimes mothers were sold away from their children, or fathers from their families. There was no legal recognition of enslaved families. No marriage that was legally binding. No parental rights that were protected. A plantation owner could separate a mother from her nursing infant if it was profitable to do so, and they did. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of reading first-hand accounts from formerly enslaved people is how many of them describe being separated from their families as children. The trauma of it echoes through their words even decades later. Josiah Henson, who was enslaved in Maryland, wrote about watching his family be sold off one by one at an auction. He was 5 years old. He described his mother begging the buyers to purchase her children along with her, promising to work harder than anyone if they'd just keep her family together. They refused. It wasn't profitable. Henson never saw most of his siblings again. This constant threat of separation had a profound psychological impact. It made it dangerous to love too deeply, to become too attached, because anyone could be taken away at any moment. And yet, enslaved families loved each other fiercely anyway. They created bonds that slavery couldn't break, even when it could separate them physically. Parents tried to prepare their children for this possibility. They would tell them to be strong, to remember who they were and where they came from, to survive no matter what. Some parents made their children memorize their full names and where they were from, just in case they were ever sold and somehow, someday, found their way back. Or so that years later, if freedom ever came, they might be able to find each other again. It was a desperate hope, but it was hope nonetheless. Now you might be wondering, did these children ever fight back? The answer is yes, but not always in the ways you might think. Open rebellion was incredibly dangerous. A child who physically fought back against an overseer or plantation owner would face brutal punishment, possibly death. So resistance took other forms. It was in the work slowdown, moving just slowly enough to avoid a beating, but not fast enough to meet the impossible quotas set for them. It was a delicate balance, but it was resistance. It was in the accidentally broken tools, an hoe that mysteriously cracked, a wagon wheel that somehow came loose. These accidents required repairs, which meant less work got done. It was in feigning illness. Enslaved people became expert at mimicking symptoms that were hard to disprove. A stomachache, dizziness. These maladies might earn a day of rest, even if the plantation owner suspected it wasn't real. It was in the small thefts, taking extra food from the plantation stores, slipping a piece of fabric for clothes. These weren't seen as stealing by the enslaved community. How could you steal from someone who stole your entire life? And for some children, as they got older, resistance meant running away. By age 14 or 15, some enslaved teenagers would attempt escape. The odds were terrible. Dogs, slave catchers, patrollers, the vast distances to free states, all worked against them. But some tried anyway. Harriet Tubman ran away at age 27, but she had attempted escape as a teenager and been caught. Each attempt taught her something that would later help her not only escape successfully, but return again and again to lead others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. For the children who stayed, who didn't or couldn't run, resistance was in maintaining their humanity, in refusing to let slavery define who they were. They created art. They sang. They told stories that kept their African heritage alive, even though most had been born in America and would never see Africa. They practiced religions that blended Christianity with African spiritual traditions, creating something new and powerful. They fell in love even though their marriages weren't legal. They had children, even though those children would be born into slavery. They chose hope over despair, again and again and again. This was perhaps the most powerful resistance of all. The refusal to be broken. The determination to remain human in a system designed to reduce them to property. So this was life for a black child growing up on a plantation in 1850. A life that began in a ledger book as a dollar amount. A childhood measured in cotton pounds and work quotas instead of birthdays and milestones. Days that started before sunrise and ended long after sunset, filled with back-breaking labor that no child should ever have to endure. It was living with constant hunger, constant fear, constant pain. It was watching your mother run across a field just to hold you for 5 minutes. It was learning to read in secret because knowledge was forbidden. It was going to sleep each night wondering if tomorrow would be the day you'd be sold away from everyone you'd ever loved. But it was also more than suffering. It was resilience. It was community. It was finding joy in the smallest moments, in a song, in a story, in a stolen hour of play. It was children who grew up to be adults who never stopped fighting for freedom, who passed down stories of survival to their own children, who, when freedom finally came after the Civil War, built schools and churches and communities, who learned to read and write astonishing numbers, making up for all those years when it was forbidden. The children we've talked about today, they're not distant historical figures. They were real. Some of them lived long enough to be photographed, to record their stories, to tell the world what they endured. And their descendants are here today. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of American history, whether that history has always acknowledged it or not. We can't change what happened. We can't undo the suffering, but we can remember. We can listen to these stories, uncomfortable as they are. We can honor the strength and resilience of those children by ensuring their experiences aren't forgotten. Because this was life for a black child growing up on a plantation in 1850. And it's a story that deserves to be told. Thank you for watching. If you found this video educational, please consider liking and subscribing. And share your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations matter. Until next time, remember, History isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, real people with real stories. And every story deserves to be heard.